in semester 1 we started off in Great Britain in 1851, to Japan, to Afghanistan, Italy, America, Paraguay, France, back to Japan again, and then we ended off on week 9 in the Dutch East Indies in 1870. So let's see if you can remember what happened. First up, we have the Great Exhibition in Great Britain 1851. We had Queen Victoria and Prince Albert throw a very big show filled with exhibits from all parts of the British Empire. They had bonnets made from palm leaves from Australia, wood carvings came from British New Zealand, and a fire engine came from Canada. The British spread their empire for 2 reasons. They earned great wealth from the colonies and the territories, and they believed that they could improve the rest of the world. Can you remember why Queen Victoria threw the Great Exhibition? Yes, I think so too. She definitely did it because she wanted to show how great Britain was compared to all the other countries. Over in Japan, Japan had been closed for over 200 years to outsiders. They didn't want the Western influence for 2 reasons. They believed that Christian missionaries might destroy Buddhism and that foreign armies might follow the missionaries into Japan. Then, the Japanese made 4 regulations to keep Western influence out. The Japanese people could not travel to other lands, anyone who landed on a foreign shore could not come home, and Western merchants could not use Japan's ports. The Dutch could land on an artificial island, but only once a year. But people wanted to trade with Japan. They wanted to buy their fine silks, they wanted to buy their ceramics, and most of all, they wanted to buy their coal. And then one day in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry came with 3 big black steamships, and he ordered the Japanese to have a meeting with their emperor. And the Japanese decided to give him the meeting with the emperor, even though that the emperor held no power in Japan at that time. They were under the leadership of a shogun. Can you remember that? They were still laughing at this funny man trying to talk to an emperor who wasn't even really the leader of the country. But they let him do it anyway. And then he spoke to the emperor, but the emperor realized, oh no, wait, this is serious, right? These ships can blow holes into this country because the samurai were lazy. They weren't really samurai fighters anymore. They were just policemen strolling up and down the streets with their knives that they don't even know how to use. So he did send a message to the shogun, and the shogun said, okay, fine, since America is insisting upon it, we will open it. And eventually, 1 year later, in 1843, they opened up their country to foreigners, and America especially. Next up is the Great Game from 1855. As you can see, Afghanistan is a country that lays between Russia and India. And everybody, once again, wanted to control Afghanistan because it lay between Russia and British India. Okay? So, Russia and British India were enemies. Russia wanted Afghanistan so they can fight British India better. British India wanted Afghanistan so they can fight Russia easier. Okay? So then the Russians and the Persians and the British started to become sly, and they played games because Afghanistan didn't want them to be overruled by other countries. So the first thing that happened was Great Britain threatened to become an enemy of Persia if Persia didn't help invade Afghanistan. So they went and tried to invade Afghanistan, but then Russia heard of it, and then Russia went and defeated them. And then the British was like, okay, you know what? Yeah, I'll borrow you some money and then we can control you. But Dost Muhammad, the president or the leader of Afghanistan at that time, knew better and said, nope, nobody will control me. I do not want debt. Okay? So then Muhammad asked the Russian soldiers to help him drive the Indians out of South Afghanistan. But the Indian army was too strong and he had to flee. Okay? And can you guess where he fled? He fled into India, hiding from the Indian army. And then the Indian army took control of Kabul, a city in Afghanistan, but they grew unpopular and people started to destroy them, and they marched back into India and they got their leader Dost Muhammad back, and it took him 15 years to rebuild his country and fight off all the foreigners, and eventually he had an independent Afghanistan, and he ruled the independent Afghanistan for 14 days until he died. Which is sad. So much fighting just to die. But that's what happened. There's the British flag top right and the Russian flag bottom right. In Italy, 1850, the people had undergone almost 4 different revolutions. Italy was not yet a country. It was divided into small little states owned by different countries all around them, and they wanted to be either a republic or a state under leadership by the Pope or ruled by a king. They just wanted to be one country. They didn't care if it was a democracy or a monarchy or whatever anyone wanted, as long as they could be one. But somehow the countries kept fighting over who owns them, and they had to go through 4 different revolutions, and 2 famous leaders of the Italian secret societies got them through these revolutions, Mazzini and Garibaldi. Eventually, in 1850, they managed to become the Republic of Italy. In 1861, 7 of the United States announced that they would no longer belong to the United States. They would become the Confederate States of America. In 1860, when Lincoln was made president, he decided that each state was allowed to decide for themselves whether slavery was legal or not. But then the states started arguing among themselves. The northern states didn't want slavery and the southern states wanted slavery, because the northern states had factories, mills and ironwork that didn't really need a lot of cheap labor, but the southern states had tobacco and cotton farms that really needed lots and lots of hands to help on the farms. Lincoln was against slavery, but he wanted his country to feel that he listened to everyone. so he left it at the time. But then in 1861, when the Confederate States of America decided to break free of him and declared war on the United States of America, a civil war broke out. The Union soldiers wore blue, they were part of the United States, and the Confederates wore grey. Those were the soldiers that wanted to break away from the United States. Lincoln's general was Ulysses S. Grant, and the Confederate Army was led by Robert E. Lee. In January 1st, 1863, Lincoln made an Emancipation Proclamation. It announced that all Confederate slaves were free, but it could not actually change things for the slaves in the South, because the South decided to keep their slaves anyway. So the war broke out, and eventually Robert E. Lee decided to surrender because the Confederate Army was weak and they ran out of food. They surrendered after 4 years of fighting, and the United States won the Civil War, and they stayed a united country. In Paraguay in 1860, things weren't looking great either. Paraguay was sandwiched between Argentina and Brazil. And you guessed it, people were fighting over that piece of land as well. Argentina wanted it to have a better stance against Brazil, and Brazil wanted it to have a better stance against Argentina. And don't forget about Uruguay, that was next to Paraguay, that wanted it for the same reason. So what happened was Paraguay was led by General Lopez, and Brazil and Uruguay became partners to fight against Paraguay, and Argentina refused him to help him fight against Brazil. So eventually Argentina joined Brazil and Uruguay, and they fought against Paraguay because Mr. Lopez just didn't want to give in. Eventually, during this war, the Triple Alliance, which was Brazil, Argentina and Uruguay, managed to beat Paraguay, and President Lopez was landlocked, and his capital city fell, and Paraguay was divided into pieces. Brazil and Argentina each took a piece, and Brazil occupied the rest. People remember Lopez in two different ways. Some remember him as a patriot fighting against Argentina and Brazil, while everyone else said he is an insane dictator, a monster without parallel. Around the same time, things weren't looking too great in France either. Within a short amount of time, France became two empires and three republics before they eventually stabilized. Started off with a monarchy where they had a king, and during the revolution they beheaded the king, and they became an empire ruled by Napoleon Bonaparte. And then Charles X forced the king to flee to England, and it became a constitutional monarchy. And eventually another person, Louis Philippe, was king. And there was another revolution, and they became the Second Republic. The first president was Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, and he used the army to arrest thousands of protesters, and then he became the Emperor of France. And then They fought with British against the Russia, declared war in Persia, and taken prisoners along with 100,000 soldiers. And then there was another revolution, and the Third Republic, the leaders made peace with Persia, and from 1870 on, France remained a republic. Wow, that was crazy. Remember a few lessons ago, Japan and America signed a treaty with Mr. Commodore Matthew Perry. Well, I can tell you that a few of the Japanese people were not very impressed with that treaty. So they overthrew the shogun, and a 17-year-old emperor took the throne. But he wasn't really the emperor. Well, he was the emperor, but he wasn't really the leader. And the noblemen of Japan took control of the country. They then sent young men to Europe to school. They hired French experts to teach them shipbuilding. They hired Americans to teach them coal mining. They hired the British to build a spinning factory. And they wore Western clothes, not Japanese robes. And the samurai was ordered to give up their swords. Samurai didn't like that either, and it caused something that we call today the Satsuma Revolt, and it was led by Saigo Takamori. And many samurai were killed because they were out of practice, and Takamori killed himself. Then Japan signed a new constitution in 1884, using Germany's constitution as the model. And then Japan had an emperor, a cabinet, a group of advisors, and 2 assemblies, which made them a democracy almost, which is very cool. It's like the British East India Company controlled India and plenty other countries in the world. There was a Dutch East India Company, and they also built some trading posts in India. But most of their trading posts were built further east on the island called the East Indies. Before long, the government of the Netherlands took over the control of the ports from the United Dutch East India Company, and at the same time, the Dutch government also took control of most of the East Indies. And the East Indies would become part of the Dutch Empire. The Dutch also wanted to claim the island of Sumatra, which lay north of the East Indies, but the British also wanted Sumatra. Great Britain had already seized Singapore, the city that lay on the very southern tip of the peninsula that jutted down from the mainland of Asia, almost touching Sumatra. If the Dutch were in Sumatra, they would be far too close to British territory. Then, in 1824, the two countries came to an agreement. The Dutch would promise never to attack Singapore, and they would give British all of the Dutch ports and settlements in India. In return, the Dutch could have Sumatra as their own. But there was a catch. The Dutch had to allow the kingdom of Aceh on the northern end of Sumatra to stay independent. That way, Aceh would be like a neutral zone between British in Singapore and the Dutch in Sumatra. At first it worked, but then it didn't. Small revolts broke out here and there, and soon the government of the Netherlands realized that the little independent kingdom was encouraging these rebellions. And in 1873, the Dutch invaded Aceh with 3,000 men. They didn't realize the fighting would go on for more than 30 years. The war dragged on for years and years, and for 24 years, it just carried on. In 1901, after almost 30 years of war, the people were captured by the Dutch, and they were sent to live in exile. 2 years later, in 1903, the Dutch finally gained control of Aceh, but the long war had been so expensive that the Dutch government had been forced to spend all the money it had made from the East Indies. What a waste of money and a waste of lives.
That's all, folks.